Well, good afternoon, happy Sabbath to you all, and greetings to everyone far and wide joining us on the webcast. Now, after Joe spoke last week on Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks prophecy, I felt the urge to go back over and tinker with a speech that I gave some time back in men's club on the last few verses of Daniel's prophecies in Daniel 11. Now, the end time events that will climax in the return of Jesus Christ are explained to us in a thumbnail outline given to us in 6 short verses at the end of chapter 11 in the book of Daniel. Now, these prophecies are very relevant to us today as they provide a thumbnail sketch of many of the key events of the Great Tribulation that will occur sometime shortly in our future in the Middle East. Now, in the 7-minute time today, I'd like to explore these 6 verses which help give us a solid foundation to understand many other Bible prophecies. Now, the prophecies at the end of Daniel 11 are the climax to a long series of prophecies starting with the Persian Empire. Now, the prophecies just before verse 40 go up to the time of the Romans, and then it jumps forward almost 2,000 years to the time of the end. Now, to many people, this is unusual, but the reason it does this is because there's no longer any Jewish presence in the Holy Land until the Jews were re-established as a nation in Palestine back in 1948. Now, in Daniel 11:40 we read, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind." So we've got 2 key powers here fighting each other, the king of the north and the king of the south. Now, before we can understand the events to come, we need to first identify who these 2 key powers are. Now, after Alexander died, his Greek empire was divided amongst his 4 generals. Now, the division based in Syria to Israel's north was ruled by the Seleucids, and the other division based in Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies. Now, the kings of these 2 Greek kingdoms are referred to as the king of the north and the king of the south in the prophecies about them in Daniel 11. Now, Israel was sandwiched in between them and was often piggy in the middle as these 2 kingdoms fought for control of the land of Israel. Now, both these Greek kingdoms were eventually conquered by the Roman Empire starting in the 1st century BC, and the Roman Empire became the new king of the north starting from verses 36 and 37, which speak of the Roman emperor worship. Now, by comparing these prophecies with others that speak of a revival of the Roman Empire in the end time, we can have confidence that a Central European-based power is this king of the north. In other words, the king of the north is effectively still Rome. Now, many evangelicals identify the king of the north as Russia, but this is guesswork as it doesn't factor in the historical context of the prophecies leading up to it. Now, the identity of the king of the south is a little less clear. Now, Rome conquered the previous king of the south. Now, obviously, to have the title the king of the south, it will be based south of Israel to have that name. Now, Egypt is specifically mentioned as one of the many conquered nations by the king of the north. So the king of the south could be Egypt, but it could also be a much wider power. Now, some other possibilities include a single Islamic caliphate, an alliance of separate Arab nations, or an alliance of Islamic terrorist groups transcending national borders. Now, the use of the word king implies a ruler with sovereignty, but it may not have to be interpreted quite so strictly, which might allow for the last possibility here. Now, there are several possibilities for the identity of the king of the south, and we'll need to wait and see which one turns out to be the truth. Now, with that as background, let's go back to verse 40 where we read, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over." So we see here that the king of the south pushes or attacks, depending on which version you have, the king of the north for some unstated reason, and then the king of the north retaliates and conquers many countries both by sea and land with a very swift attack that is rather reminiscent of Hitler's Blitzkrieg or lightning war. Now, in an old WCG brochure entitled The Middle Eastern Prophecy, Keith Stump, commenting on this passage, writes, "Why will Europe feel compelled to intervene in the Middle East? Here prophecy is silent. Europe's ire might well be precipitated by a sudden cut-off of vital oil supplies, the industrial lifeblood of the continent. Or it might be triggered by some sort of jihad, holy war, waged against the West by Muslim fundamentalists. Whatever the provocation, prophecy reveals that Europe will act swiftly to protect its interests, dispatching troops into the Middle East. The European power, this king of the north or beast, will occupy both the state of Israel and some of her Arab neighbours, including according to this clear prophecy of Daniel." End of quote. Now, continuing on in verse 41, we read, "He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries will be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps." Now, the glorious land, as we'll see in verse 45, refers to the land of Israel. Now, many nations will be conquered, but Edom, Moab, and Ammon will be spared. Now, these three ancient lands today are all in the land of Jordan. Now, it should be noted that Jordan is probably the most moderate of the Middle East nations around Israel, and generally terrorists are not known to be Jordanians, so this may be part of the reason that they are allowed to retain their sovereignty. Now, the king of the north will take over the gold and silver of Egypt. Now, taking Egypt's gold reserves through conquest, as Hitler did when he conquered much of Europe, is perhaps one factor in how this future system will prosper. Now, the reference to the Libyans and the Ethiopians appears to indicate further conquest into Africa. Now, the Roman Empire, as well as Hitler in World War II, both saw North Africa as vital to control access throughout the Mediterranean. Now, similarly, controlling Egypt through to Ethiopia helps to ensure control of the Red Sea. Now, Revelation 11:2 indicates that this battle is right at the beginning of the Great Tribulation, as Jerusalem is stated there as being trod by the Gentiles for 42 months, the whole length of the Great Tribulation. And Jerusalem being trodden will also include the future fulfilment of the abomination of desolation. Now, Daniel 12:11 indicates that the abomination of desolation in Jerusalem occurs around this same time. Now, if the 1260 days of Jerusalem's occupation and the 1290 days from the abomination of desolation have the same endpoint with the return of Jesus Christ, that would appear to present a bit of a mystery as to why the abomination seemingly occurs a month before Jerusalem is conquered. Now, as Paul said, we look through a dark glass dimly. Now, some prophecies are clear and direct, while others are not so clear and might only be understood in hindsight. Now, in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, it speaks of the man of sin sitting in the temple of God as God himself. Now, he is likely to be the same person as the false prophet of the book of Revelation. Now, this blasphemous act of his is not the abomination of desolation, as that is referred to by Jesus in Matthew 24:15 as not sitting, but standing in the holy place. Now, it's hard to imagine how a tabernacle or temple that the man of sin sits in could be built on the Temple Mount without sparking some sort of jihad. Now, if that would be impossible for the Jews, I've often wondered how might this prophecy be fulfilled. I've also wondered what might happen if the Jews were to actually find the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if they did find it, the Jews would probably feel compelled to house the Ark in some sort of tabernacle. And if they had a tabernacle with the Ark, the Jews could possibly feel that they could start sacrifices again, even if it's not on the Temple Mount. Now, as Orthodox Jews don't recognise Jesus as Messiah, from their perspective, the only way that they could feel that their sins could be truly forgiven is through a sacrificial system. hence why they are so keen to see a temple built in Jerusalem. Now in Zechariah 14:2 it notes that half of the city will go into captivity. Now this may simply refer to half of the people being taken away captive. Now another possibility is that half of the city will be conquered by the king of the north, and the other half might be given to the Palestinians or the Jordanians, who we saw before were spared. Now the old city is broken up into 4 rather unequal quarters. Now the Roman Church would only be interested in the left 2 quarters, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, the traditional site where Jesus was crucified, and they have much less interest in the other half of the old city. Now when Israel and Egypt are invaded, one would expect a response from America and Britain, but this time around things will not end well for America and Britain. Now there are many prophecies that speak of Assyria conquering the modern Israelite nations and not just the Jews, such as Jeremiah 30 and Isaiah 10, which time does not permit going into. Now their defeat appears to happen quite quickly. Now Hosea 5:7 indicates both Israel and Judah will fall within a month, or a new moon as it says there. Now when they were conquered in ancient times by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, these conquests occurred about 120 years apart. So this does appear to be an end-time prophecy. Now Isaiah 9:14, which also may be a future prophecy, speaks of Israel being destroyed in one day. Now is this perhaps a reference to the unthinkable, a surprise nuclear attack? Only time will tell how these prophecies will come about. Now coming back to Daniel 11, the next event referred to in verse 44 appears to be mirrored in Revelation 9, which appears to occur between 2 and 3 years later. But news out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, and therefore he will go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly take away many. Now this European power will be troubled from the north and the east, or northeast, and go out to destroy this threat. Now this appears to be the nations of Russia and Asia. Now in Revelation 9, a great military power appears to unleash a biochemical assault, followed by another attack from the east with a 200 million army. Now the first attack is likely to be that is referred to in Daniel 11:44. The second attack is probably a counterattack from the Far East to a European biochemical assault. Now in the last verse there, in Daniel 11:45, we read, "And he, the king of the north," which is the coming European beast power, "shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come unto his end, and none shall help him." Now in some way, the beast power will be based in Jerusalem, which is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea. And this is where it will come to its end when Jesus Christ returns. In Revelation 16, the kings of the east cross the Euphrates and gather at Armageddon, or the plain near Megiddo in northern Israel, which is controlled by Europe, who they've come to fight in the Middle East. Now it's at this point that Jesus Christ returns and defeats these armies and brings an end to the bloodshed of the Great Tribulation. Now Zechariah 14 tells us, "Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth." So Jesus Christ will return with his saints who will be resurrected, and he will then bring an end to this horrible world war that begins and will end in the Middle East. And when this battle comes to an end, God's wonderful kingdom will begin on this earth, a time that we all look forward to.